How different would the video game world have been if Super Smash Bros. Didn't feature any Nintendo characters at all? Or if Halo was a real time strategy game? Did you know that Popeye inadvertently led to the creation of Mario? Or that Super Mario Bros. 2 wasn't Super Mario Bros. 2 at all? Look, it's no surprise to learn that some video games finish at very different places than where they started. What probably is a surprise is to learn just how different some video games were originally meant to be. Let's take a look at 7 games that finished in a very, very different place than where they started. First, Mortal Kombat. This, of course, is a classic series, one that spans 3 decades, 12 full-fledged games, 2 movies, and a massive lore that continues to evolve today. The basic plot is something that most of us have seen before. You play as one of dozens of characters that have an intricate backstory, fighting to win a galaxy-wide fighting tournament, avenge your family, win a big trophy, shiny things, all that good stuff. The characters themselves are legendary. Mortal Kombat is home to classic characters like Sub-Zero, Raiden, and Johnny Cage. So Johnny Cage, let's talk about him for a second. Because if the creator's original vision had come to fruition, there would be no Johnny Cage. Instead, there'd be Jeanne Claude Van Damme. And I don't mean in Mortal Kombat 1, but the original game. Yeah, him. The bad actor who punches things. Which, if we're being honest, perfectly qualifies him for a role in Mortal Kombat. Van Damme was at the height of his popularity in the late 80s and early 90s. The action star was an accomplished martial arts fighter, and his skills were used repeatedly in movies where he would punch, kick, choke, and murder his way to box office success. And that's where this story comes in. The first Mortal Kombat came out in 1992, and Van Damme was just removed from some of his biggest hits, including Bloodsport, Lionheart, and Double Impact. Bloodsport, in particular, made an impact on the 4 men who helped create Mortal Kombat. In fact, they liked it so much that they basically tried to turn another upcoming Van Damme movie, Universal Soldier, into a video game. That deal never came together. However, Van Damme's influence wasn't lost on Mortal Kombat. The origins of Johnny Cage, a cheesy martial artist and actor, were based on Van Damme's character in Bloodsport, and fortunately, it really was meant to be. In 2023, 31 years after the premiere of the first Mortal Kombat, players can finally play as Johnny Cage, as Mortal Kombat 1 allows players to put on a Jean-Claude Van Damme skin. Hold on to your dreams, kids. If you produce a multi-billion-dollar franchise, you too can get aging movie actors to appear in your video game. Next, Pac-Man, the 80s icon, was almost a slightly different name. And yes, there's a very good reason, and honestly kind of a funny story, behind why it changed. You are almost certainly familiar with Pac-Man, our little pie-shaped yellow friend who runs around eating pellets and avoiding Blinky, Pinky, Inky, and Clyde. Pac-Man has been around since the 1980s, and if you are my age, you are probably familiar with the countless home console and mobile adaptations. That being said, Pac-Man wasn't always a home console success, or a failure as the Atari home version infamously made it. Instead, it started its career in an arcade cabinet, and that, in large part, is why the name was changed. Originally, Pac-Man wasn't called Pac-Man at all, Pac-Man. The name was based on the Japanese term paku paku taburu, which refers to gobbling something up. First arcade cabinet for Pac-Man appeared in Tokyo and was met with widespread approval and acclaim. Namco executives, sensing a hit, moved to release the game in America and Europe. However, Namco America executives had a few changes. Chief among them, the name. Pac-Man, of course, would be appearing in bars and arcades across the country. People drinking alcohol and teenagers who frequented these arcades aren't exactly known for great maturity or restraint, and it was feared that the word puck would be vandalized and replaced with a word that rhymed but is slightly more vulgar. Masaya Nakamura, president of Namco, opted to rename the game Pac-Man, and that is the name that stuck. Alright, if we're going to be talking about games that changed over the course of development, it would be a crime if I didn't discuss Super Mario 2, the original on NES. I suspect some of you may have heard this story before, since it's one of the most well-known and frequently covered video game changes in history. The Super Mario Bros. 2 we know today looked nothing like the original game. In fact, the original game was practically something that we would consider to be DLC. The first sequel was released in Japan in 1986, and it can basically be categorized as a more advanced version of the original Super Mario Bros. It had a slew of brand new features, including more complicated level design, wind, poison mushrooms, and more. However, this made American Nintendo executives nervous. The game was much harder than the original. Howard Phillips of Nintendo said this about the game, quote, "I found that Super Mario Bros. 2 asked me again and again to take a leap of faith. and each of those times resulted in my immediate death. This was not a fun game to play. It was punishment. Undeserved punishment. Ouch. Anyway, Nintendo scrapped the game for American release, but this left them with a problem. No sequel. And that, was pretty bad. And this is where Doki Doki Panic comes in. In 1987, Yumi Kojo Doki Doki Panic was released in Japan. The game was designed as a partnership between Nintendo and Fuji Television, a major broadcasting company in Japan. It was meant to help Yumi Kojo 87, which promoted the network and their various properties. The game featured 4 playable characters who would go on side-scrolling and vertical adventures. So instead of creating a new game, Nintendo America president Minoru Arakawa requested that Doki Doki Panic basically be reskinned into Mario 2. Mario, Luigi, Toad, and Princess Toadstool were slapped over the main characters of Doki Doki Panic, graphics were changed, and some enemy sprites were altered. More graphical changes were made, and the game was released to the American public. It is unquestionably an outlier in the Mario Bros. Franchise, with many traditional elements of other games being eliminated, only to see their eventual restoration in Mario Bros. 3 and subsequent games. However, the game did result in numerous series mainstays, including Shy Guys, Pokies, Bob-ombs, and more. The classic game would eventually sell more than 3.6 million copies. Various iterations and releases of the game would cross 37 million copies worldwide, grossing close to $2 billion. Not bad for a reskinned game. Of course, all was not lost for those of you who wanted the original game. The original design of Super Mario Bros. 2 was released in 1993's Super Mario All-Stars, albeit with more frequent checkpoints so players didn't completely lose their minds. Next, let's talk Halo, specifically Halo Combat Evolved, the very first game of the Halo series. We've covered some strange twists here, but this is the only game I know of that wouldn't just have a few cosmetic changes or a name change or two. It was supposed to be 2 entirely different genres before merging as the classic first-person shooter we all know it as. Halo Combat Evolved was the first Xbox game. Even at the time, Halo Combat Evolved was legendary and groundbreaking. It was Xbox's first release and put the system on the map, selling millions of copies and launching the Xbox as a world-class console. However, in its original iteration, Halo Combat Evolved was supposed to be released in a very, very different way. Originally, Bungie, the lead developer of the game, designed it to be a real-time strategy game. Indeed, the earliest version of Halo was described as containing an open world. You would control the Master Chief and his troops from the sky, moving across the world and slaughtering the Covenant. This was the version of the game that was actually first revealed to the public, as you can see in Bungie footage that was aired at Macworld 1999. Like many pre-alpha games, this one, compared to the original, was... it was weird. It was just plain weird. The Master Chief had his armor and his voice, but he also had a companion named Blindwolf that he could ride like a horse. Heck, even the potential names of the series were different. Crystal Palace and the Santa Machine were apparently considered. Ho ho ho. Mm-hmm. So, how did Halo change to what we know today? Well, the technology evolved and improved. As it did, the camera drew closer to Master Chief and became a third-person shooter. Then, first-person shooter. In fact, as is often the case, the game design itself led to even further design changes. Said designer Jamie Gressimer, quote, "I think the Warthog is the real reason Halo became an action game. In the old RTS-style game, it was just so cool. To watch a squad of Jeeps driving across the terrain, we wanted to drive them ourselves. And then we wanted to get out and run around as an infantry guy. From there, it snowballed into what we eventually shipped." Indeed, the change in design was noted by some to be a gradual change, only coming together in the final 4 to 5 weeks of development, which is honestly insane when you think about it. A game we all have come to love and value so much, a game that was a staple of so many of our youths, was supposed to fit into at least 2 different genres than the one it was eventually released as. Quick aside, like what you see and want to watch more? Please hit that subscribe button, like the video, or comment below. Let us know what you're thinking and what else you want to hear. Alright, let's go to another one of the more stunning ones, Super Smash Bros. Pretty much everyone knows this series. The first game came out in 1999 and was revolutionary. It was a fighting game that featured some of Nintendo's most famous intellectual property beating the crap out of each other. Indeed, it was the first time you could ever play as Mario or any number of the original characters and, again, beat the crap out of each other. It was also one of the original crossover games for the Nintendo 64, allowing you to play as dozens of characters from multiple classic franchises and in multiple in-game locations. 5 Smash Bros. Games have since come out, and the game has moved from a classic high school and college party game to one with an incredible competitive and online scene. Also, it almost never happened. In fact, if Nintendo executives had had their original wish, it never would have. Nintendo, like many major brands, is, understandably, extremely protective of their intellectual property. Nintendo has always prided itself on being a family-friendly brand. I mean, think about it. How much blood and gore do you see in their games compared to games on, like, the Xbox or the PlayStation? They've been this way since the 1980s, when the company first found commercial success, in part by sticking to the strictest possible quality standards, and ensuring that third-party developers could only produce so many games at a time. So originally, game designer Masahiro Sakurai wanted to develop a 4-way fighting game, and he enlisted Satoru Iwata to help. The two developed a prototype of their fighting game, but they used generic colored models. In fact, the characters looked like versions of the Pepsi mascot at the time, thus resulting in the game's early copy being codenamed Pepsi Man. The two developers knew that they had to make the game stand out. So to do so, they put in Nintendo characters. Now here's the thing, they never had permission to do that. This request almost certainly would have been shot down by Nintendo higher-ups. Keep in mind that the two men didn't work for Nintendo, they worked for HAL Laboratories, which was a second-party developer. In other words, the two men were pretty clearly violating copyright laws and stepping all over Nintendo's intellectual property. The idea worked anyway. Sometimes it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. When presented with the idea, Nintendo executives loved it. They greenlit it. The rest is Nintendo history. As of January 2023, the game has sold more than 66 million copies and is the 7th best-selling franchise in Nintendo history. Completely switching gears for a second, let's talk about everyone's favorite ape, Donkey Kong. And of all the stories that I've told so far, this might be the one with the most widespread possible ramifications. Believe it or not, in its original design, it would have been Popeye, not Donkey Kong, who became a staple of our video game youth. Instead, the original Donkey Kong actually led to some of the most well-known and legendary video game characters that exist today. It's 1980, and Nintendo of America is just getting started. At the time, they are a startup that needs money and success. President Minoru Arakawa has ordered 3,000 unsold copies of Radar Scope, an arcade game, and needs to convert those arcade cabinets into a different game. The company settled on the concept of Donkey Kong, where the player would have to move up a series of ramps and ladders, avoiding barrels and other obstacles thrown by an antagonist in an effort to save their girlfriend. However, as originally designed, there was no Donkey Kong, no Mario, and no Pauline. Instead, it was supposed to be Popeye, trying to rescue his girlfriend Olive Oil from the clutches of the evil Bluto. But Nintendo had to get the license to Popeye, and that didn't happen. So instead, Arakawa had to look elsewhere for characters. The end result was Donkey Kong, Pauline, and Jumpman, who you may know better as Mario. You heard that right. If Nintendo had published Donkey Kong as Popeye, there may not have been any Mario. Donkey Kong was wildly popular, earning Nintendo more than $280 million by the close of 1982. It helped establish Nintendo as a major player in the video game scene and eventually influenced the creation of the Nintendo Entertainment System. Here's the weirdest part of this story. Nintendo actually did get the license to Popeye, and in 1982, they released a Popeye arcade cabinet game anyway. The game was very similar to Donkey Kong. Players play as Popeye, they have to collect items thrown by Olive Oil, walking around a stage and avoiding enemies. Kinda strange to think about. And last, let's talk about Space Invaders. Now, in our last video, we discussed how Space Invaders accidentally invented the difficulty curve. Funny thing about that, Space Invaders wasn't supposed to feature you killing aliens at all. Instead, you were supposed to be murdering rows of soldiers. So, Space Invaders features you controlling an alien ship, you shoot aliens who get closer and closer to your cities, and, have to save the galaxy, all that good stuff. Space Invaders came out in 1979, 2 years after the first Star Wars and 1 year before the second one. Interest in space was thriving, so it makes sense that the game's developer, Tomohiro Nishikaro, would use spaceships, right? Not what Nishikaro actually meant. Originally, he tried tanks, warships, and planes, but he didn't like the animations for any of those. Then, Nishikaro switched to people and had a slowly advancing line of soldiers getting closer and closer to your screen. But game executives told him not to do this. As Nishikaro told The Guardian in a 2018 interview, by far, the best match were soldiers. Shooting people was frowned upon. It was at this time, while I was stuck for an alternative, that I chanced upon Star Wars, and realized that I could use aliens because no one would complain about shooting them. So, Nishikaro used spaceships to stop people from whining. Yeah, I feel him on that one. That is it for this edition of Almost Something. If you like what you saw, please click that subscribe button, and let us let you know when we've got more content coming. Hit the like button too, that really does help. And as always, I would love to hear what you have to say, and to get more video ideas, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. Above all else, thank you so much for watching. We've grown a lot lately, and I hope you are enjoying watching these videos as much as I like making them. So with that said, have a wonderful day out there, and don't let there be any almost in your life. Take care.